I'm Nima Rajan. Climate change is threatening to have a major impact on the way many of us earn a living. A new analysis says more than 880,000 Canadians work in industries at risk of decline or closure in the global transition to clean energy. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices is warning in its publication, Sink or Swim, that the transition to a low-carbon economy is coming, whether Canada and its industries like it or not. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says requiring members of parliament to be fully vaccinated in order to enter the House of Commons is easily the right decision. Speaking after his phone call yesterday with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Mr. Singh said his party backs the Liberals and Bloc Québécois. They support full vaccination for anyone entering the Commons precinct. He calls the mandate from the multi-party Board of Internal Economy an important measure to keep everyone safe. Well, meanwhile, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is being urged to make a move to battle the opioid crisis by decriminalizing the possession and use of illicit drugs. Almost 70 Canadian organizations, including the BC Civil Liberties Association and the HIV Legal Network, have written a letter to Prime Minister Trudeau asking him to make drug policy reform a priority for his re-elected Liberal government. They want drug possession to be decriminalized and all criminal penalties related to drug use to be eliminated. They also want federal funding to ensure low-barrier access to a safe drug supply. An annual report on climate change and human health says the risk of Canadian seniors dying in a heat wave grew over 50% in the last 2 decades. The Lancet Countdown study notes it was just this summer that a punishing heat dome parked over BC and parts of the prairies. It killed at least 570 people in Canada and hundreds more in the U.S. Dr. Courtney Howard, an emergency room doctor and one of the report's authors, says Canada needs to do more to protect its people. This as climate change events like heat waves and forest fires become more intense and frequent. British Columbia's Forests Minister has introduced a bill to amend the Forest and Range Practices Act. She says it would reshape forest management in the province. Catherine Conroy told the legislature the proposed changes include a greater focus on the health of forests and ecosystems. Minister Conroy says the changes would align key forestry legislation with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The province will work in partnership with Indigenous nations on land management decisions within their territories. Drivers in Saskatchewan could be paying less for vehicle insurance next year. The Saskatchewan Rate Review Panel is recommending the provincial government approve an overall rate decrease of 1.3%. That would be instead of the revenue-neutral rate change originally proposed by the Saskatchewan Auto Fund to start January 21st. The panel says whether people see a discount on their insurance would depend on several factors, including the class of vehicle they drive. Ontario is set to introduce legislation that would make it easier for immigrants to get licensed to work in professions that match their areas of expertise. Labour Minister Monty McNaughton says the proposed legislation would, if passed, help ease Ontario's labour shortage. This is by preventing many regulatory bodies from requiring immigrants to have Canadian work experience to get licensed. It would also ensure licensing applications are processed faster. Changes would apply to licensing bodies, governing engineers, architects, teachers, accountants, and social workers. It would also help internationally trained workers in 23 trades, including electricians and plumbers, but it would not affect those regulating medical professions. South Korea's mega hit Squid Game quickly became Netflix's most-watched show over the last month, but Quebec parents and school boards worry that the violence is being mimicked on playgrounds. The series is rated for mature audiences only, but Quebec teachers say they are noticing themes from Squid Game showing up in student artwork and during recess play. The Canadian Beverage Association says the sector is disappointed and concerned about Newfoundland and Labrador's new tax on sugary drinks. The association says the tax is regressive and that it will hurt businesses. The tax will increase the price of sugar-sweetened beverages by 20 cents a litre, and the government estimates it will net about $9 million a year. Officials say the tax is intended to improve health outcomes by dissuading consumers from buying as many sugary drinks. A lone Canadian finalist has won a prestigious international piano competition in Poland. Bruce Leo of Canada was named early today as the winner of the $45,000 first prize in the Frédéric Chopin International. The jury's announcement came hours after he played as the last entrant among the 12 finalists at the pandemic-delayed event. All right, after the break, we talk about violence against public figures. So stay tuned. We'll have an interview with Dr. Barbara Perry, director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, up next. We'll be right back. Canada has seen a rise in cases of harassment against elected officials, especially during the pandemic and the federal election campaign. Early in September, a man threw gravel at Prime Minister Justin Trudeau during his campaign stop in London, Ontario. And he was not alone. Incidents of harassment had been reported by political candidates from multiple federal parties during the election campaign. In the UK, 69-year-old British MP David Amos was stabbed to death by a 25-year-old while meeting with constituents on Friday. These instances of hate crimes are concerning politicians abroad as well as in Canada as they continue to be harassed themselves. Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Barbara Perry, director at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, and chair at the International Network on Hate Studies. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Good to see you.
Now, what do you think is behind this spike in violence or harassment against politicians?
I think there's a lot of factors coming together. I mean, there is a history of targeting politicians and those running for office. In the past, it's really been a focus on people of color and women who are in those positions. But now we're seeing sort of a widening of the targeting. And I think that it has to do with this broader lack of civility that we're seeing in politics and to some extent in the broader society. We're seeing, the really negative politics of, personal attacks coming from the parties and from the political leaders themselves. So I think they're contributing to the issue themselves. And then we add COVID into the mix. And this is really, I think, what we're seeing drive it in particular right now, because we're seeing a reaction against government policies. Sometimes it's because the government isn't acting quickly enough or enough generally, but more frequently it's a reaction against the lockdowns and the masking and vaccination certificates, all of those sorts of things. So there is all of that anxiety associated with COVID that's being directed now towards politicians who are held responsible for so many of the problems that people are facing.
And some of these cases can be extreme, ma'am. We saw the killing of Sir David Amos in the UK. We saw a lot of Canadian MPs express concern over their own personal safety following this killing. So are these concerns justified?
Yeah, it is a global problem. I mean, we certainly saw what happened to the MP in the UK, but we also saw what happened in the US with, conspiracies and real viable conspiracies against the Michigan State Legislature, obviously January 6th. And in our own context, we're hearing from politicians of all stripes about threats and about attacks on their offices, about death threats, in fact, and for women's threats of sexual violence as well. It just takes one person to escalate that discourse to action to do some very serious damage to individuals, communities, and I think to the democratic process as well, because it does silence people. It discourages them from wanting to run and to engage in the political process.
So what do we know so far about where Canada stands when it comes to the overall safety and protection of public figures in these cases?
Well, we haven't seen a great escalation. It was something I was certainly fearful of in the federal election. We didn't see the escalation to extreme violence that I think many of us were fearful of. Those threats could materialize at any point. We do have an election coming up in Ontario in the spring, and we're already starting to see some negative attack ads coming out. And I think that that's one of the things we need to put a stop to. That the politicians themselves don't need to add fuel to the fire. I think that can contribute to the same problems, and perhaps, given what we saw in the federal election, an escalation at the provincial level if we don't put the brakes on this.
And what sort of role does social media play in this overall issue, ma'am? We know Facebook is facing a lot of criticism. The January insurrection was also blamed on social media posts. So how does social media play into all of this?
Oh, it's so important in this area because it really is the space where these sorts of narratives are disseminated and shared very widely. We're all subject to them on our Twitter feeds or Facebook or whatever other platforms we're on. So there's a bombardment, a regular bombardment of those kinds of messages that contribute to the hostility and potentially the violence. But we also saw, as you said, in January 6th, this is where we're seeing sort of coalitions, and we're seeing individuals and groups coming together to also strategize about how they can, attack or mob or otherwise harass politicians. So it is, it's for the sharing of narratives, but also for planning action.
All right, ma'am, just about 20 seconds left here, but where can people find out more about this issue and how to make a difference?
Well, sadly, I don't think we have a lot of places that are monitoring these sorts of activities. The work that we do at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, we're certainly engaged in this. And there are a few smaller centers, but always, federal government ministries that oversee, electoral processes.
We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. With us now is Catherine Murray of The Buck Stops Here to give us our weekly market update. All yours, Catherine.
Thanks, Nima, and hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Murray with your weekly market recap. A number of key items going on in the market with some new fresh record highs across the board. Today, we are seeing a little bit of a sideways trade to the activity today. But this is, of course, seeing the TSX setting a new record high, 4 session highs in a row, closing out yesterday. We're also seeing the CAD, Canadian dollar, a little bit lower versus the US dollar, but certainly still holding near the best levels we've seen for the Canadian dollar since July. WTI is trading a little bit lower, but of course that is after finishing up 1.2% yesterday, which is a 7-year high. And importantly as well, we're seeing Bitcoin pull back also after setting a new record high. Importantly as well, when we think about WTI or the price of oil, there are more and more strategists and analysts around the world calling for higher oil prices. Speaking of which, we did get the September CPI reading here in Canada. Inflation is at its highest level we've seen since 2003, or 2 decades, up by 4.4%. And a couple of key items to take away. Meat was up 9.5%, bacon up 20%, gas up 32%. And the big question here is whether or not this is transitory. Obviously, we're all feeling the effects of this. Important data point ahead of the BOC, the Bank of Canada meeting next week, where there is expectations that they will announce another taper to their bond buying program. But perhaps more importantly is what will this mean, this higher inflation rate, for interest rate hikes? And the market right now is pricing in a hike in the March-April time period. But there are some analysts out there who are expecting 4 hikes next year, and then 4 more in 2023. Specifically, this is coming from Scotiabank to have a benchmark interest rate at 2.25%. Why does that matter? It's your cost of borrowing. So be aware that that is a big headline in the news these days. Also, in terms of corporate news, interestingly here, there's a U.S. activist investor, Elliott Management, building a sizable position in CN Rail. Separately, RBC downgraded the stock. We're also, of course, keeping our eyes on other stocks here in Canada. Rogers, for one, they reported an inline earnings, slight revenue miss, but the earnings were in line. Important to note. And also CIBC downgrading a number of forestry companies such as Resolute, Western Forest, as well as West Fraser. That's on the Canadian side. When we take a look at the U.S. markets, we did see the Dow have a record close yesterday. S&P has been up 6 straight sessions in a row. And of course, we are in the midst of earnings season in the United States. Canadian earnings kicks off a little bit more over the next couple of weeks. But bottom line with U.S. earnings, we are seeing some nice earnings beats. So solid performance from these companies. The themes, though, that the company managements are talking about, of course, continues to be supply chain constraints, increasing costs. They are, however, seeing good demand, a healthy consumer, good balance sheet. So all of that is good news. And on the economic front in the United States, we did have initial weekly jobless claims this morning. Second week in a row below 300,000. Those are very good numbers in terms of the health of the U.S. jobs market. Existing home sales did come in higher than expected, another positive read on the economy. At the same time, we did have the Fed beige book, the US Federal Reserve's beige book out yesterday, saying that there were a few districts that showed economic growth slowing down. So we are still obviously in this recovery. From some company and stock specific news, very positive news with respect to Pfizer and BioNTech announcing their phase 3 trial data showing high efficacy of the booster dose for COVID-19 vaccine. Also importantly as well, the FDA approved Moderna as well as J&J COVID-19 vaccine booster doses in eligible people. Also positive there. And just back to the earnings in the United States, Tesla did have an earnings beat. That stock is up by 2%. They did show some good, strong gross margins. Netflix had some good numbers, but stock did trade a little bit lower, bit of a mixed picture in terms of their guidance. But most importantly, the key metric is subscribers, and that is on the positive side, meeting investor expectations. Also, from a stock perspective, Carnival Cruise Lines, CCL is the ticker there. That got a nice upgrade as well. But bottom line, I think when we're talking about the markets these days, key is going to be what the inflation picture really looks like. Is it transitory, or will the central bankers around the world, but let's talk about North America, have to play catch up a little bit in terms of increasing the rates to keep up with inflation? That's going to be key and critical to watch for the markets and market reaction. That does it for me. Nima, back to you.
Lots to keep our eyes out for, Catherine. Thanks for that. For more financial analysis and news with Catherine Murray, check out The Buck Stops Here on the News Forum Network. All right, stay tuned. We'll be back after a short break with more stories from around the world. Stay tuned. Russia registered the highest daily numbers of new coronavirus infections and deaths since the start of the pandemic. The government coronavirus task force reported 36,339 new confirmed infections and 1,036 deaths in the past 24 hours. This brought Russia's death toll to 227,389, which is by far the highest in Europe. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered Russians to stay off work for a period starting October 30th and extending through the following week. Moscow's mayor followed up with more restrictions in the capital. India has administered 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine, passing a milestone for the South Asian country where the Delta variant fueled its first crushing surge this year. About 75% of India's total eligible adult population have received at least one dose, while 30% are fully immunized. Coronavirus cases have fallen sharply since the devastating months earlier this year when the Delta variant, first detected in India a year ago, was infecting hundreds of thousands of residents daily. U.S. health regulators have signed off on extending COVID-19 boosters to Americans who got the Moderna or Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Officials with the FDA also say anyone eligible for a booster can get a brand that is different from the one they initially received. The latest moves could expand booster eligibility to tens of millions of Americans. The mixing and matching arrangement makes it easier to get a second dose, especially for those who had side effects from their first shots. 250,000 French homes are without electricity this morning, and trains have been halted from Normandy to the Paris region. This comes after powerful winds swept across swaths of northern France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Local media report 4 people were injured in the Dutch town of Barendrecht. This as gusting winds ripped tiles off roofs and uprooted trees in a residential neighborhood before dawn today. France's National Weather Service still has storm warnings in effect in the country's northeastern corner. Well, meanwhile, floods and landslides triggered by days of torrential rains have killed at least 99 people in Nepal since Monday. Forecasters are anticipating moderate rainfall later Thursday, but expect the weather to improve by the end of the week. In neighboring India, heavy downpours this week have also wreaked havoc, killing at least 88 people. This while flooding roads, destroying bridges, and causing landslides. Iran has kicked off an annual Air Force drill across the country. This comes a week after holding another massive exercise in air defense. State TV reported that bombers, jet fighters, and attack and surveillance drones will participate in the drill on Thursday. It said all Iranian military air bases will participate in the maneuver. Iran reportedly has 12 air bases. The drill comes a week after Iran held a 2-day annual air defense drill. Australia and Britain are defending their nuclear submarine deal with the U.S. This comes amid concerns it could escalate tensions in the region and spark an arms race. UK Minister for Armed Forces James Heappey says there has been a lot of overhyping of the pact known as AUKUS. He says the UK and the US have been sharing such technologies for decades and that Australia's decision to join was merely to develop its own submarine capability. The pact will provide Australia with nuclear reactors to power its submarines, but the subs will not be nuclear armed. Britain and New Zealand have agreed to a trade deal that eliminates tariffs on a wide range of goods. The deal was cemented in a conference call between UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his New Zealand counterpart Jacinda Ardern on Wednesday. This comes after 16 months of talks by negotiators. Although New Zealand accounts for only 0.2% of UK trade, Britain hopes it will help open the door toward membership in the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. The partnership, which includes Japan, Canada, and Vietnam, had GDP of £8.4 trillion in 2020. The Australian outback town of Quilpie hoped its offer of free residential land to anyone who would make it their home might attract 5 new families to the remote community of 800. But authorities have been overwhelmed by more than 250 inquiries in less than 2 weeks from around Australia and internationally. Under the plan, people who buy a block of land, build a house, and live in it for 6 months are eligible for $12,500 in grants. That is the price of a block of land, so the council is effectively giving the land away. A bus ride being offered in Hong Kong is definitely a snoozer, but not to worry, it's meant to be that way. The roughly 76-kilometer, 5-hour journey on a double-decker is aimed at helping the sleep-deprived rest. Rides are between $13 and $51 per person, depending on whether riders choose an upper or lower level seat. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. This was Forum Daily News. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.